Something happened to me during a single year of my life that permanently rearranged the way I understand fear. Not the kind of fear that spikes for a second when you hear a strange noise. The other kind. The kind that moves in quietly, unpacks its bags, starts rearranging the furniture of your mind in the middle of the night when you're too exhausted to fight it. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 4 stories. 4 real accounts. 4 different people. 4 situations that started ordinary, embarrassingly ordinary, and became something none of them could have predicted. All 4 of these stories have one thing in common. The danger came from someone who seemed safe. Someone nearby. Someone familiar. Someone who already knew too much.
Welcome back to Midnight Case Files. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is a place where we take true stories seriously. No embellishment needed. Real life in the right circumstances is more terrifying than anything fiction has managed to produce. Tonight, we have 4 of them. 4 accounts, all different, all true, all connected by that specific, suffocating experience of realizing that the person you thought was just around has actually been watching you, studying you, building a map of your life without your permission. We're going to move through all 4 tonight. Pour yourself something warm, turn the lights down, and stay with me. This is a year of fear.
I want to start with a story about a mistake, because that's where this year began. Not with something dramatic, not with a mysterious stranger appearing at a window. It began with a bad decision made on a Friday night by an 18-year-old who thought he was smarter than he was. He tried to steal a phone from Walmart. He wasn't smarter than the cameras. He wasn't smarter than the loss prevention officer who had been watching him from the moment he picked up the display model and angled his body away from the nearest lens. Within minutes, a hand landed on his shoulder, heavy, practiced, final, and the rest of that Friday night became something else entirely. Within an hour, he was sitting in the back of a police car, staring through a wire-reinforced window at the same parking lot he'd walked through 100 times before. Families were loading groceries. A kid was eating something in a shopping cart. Normal things, unbearably normal things, and he was watching them from the other side of a cage, understanding for the first time that normal was not a state you were guaranteed. The timing was the first cruel twist. Friday night, courts closed until Monday. No bail hearing until then. He wasn't going anywhere for the weekend. He was going to jail. The cell is everything now. Booking stripped him of his identity one item at a time: wallet, phone, keys, hoodie, and then the orange jumpsuit. And something about putting that on was worse than any of the preceding steps, because it meant the system had fully processed him. He was no longer a person who had made a mistake. He was a case number in a system that moved at its own pace. They placed him in a holding area with other detainees. He was the youngest person in the room by years, probably by a decade in most cases. He sat quietly, kept his eyes low, tried to look like someone who was comfortable, because he'd heard somewhere that looking frightened was an invitation. He was terrified. He eventually ended up in a cell. His cellmate introduced himself as Bob. Bob was older, late 40s, calm eyes, a voice that moved at half the speed of ordinary conversation. In another context, that kind of voice might have seemed trustworthy. At first, Bob was almost soothing. He told the kid to relax, that the weekend would pass, that he'd been through this plenty of times. He had the air of someone completely at home in a place designed to make everyone feel the opposite, and in the early hours that felt almost reassuring. Then the question started. What are you in for? How old are you? Where are you from? Conversational, harmless, The kind of questions you answer without thinking because you've been answering versions of them your whole life. Then the questions changed. Do you live alone? Does your family know you're here? Do you have a girlfriend, a roommate, anyone waiting for you? The kid gave vague answers, one-word answers. He turned away and tried to sleep. But sleep in that place was not a refuge. The fluorescent lights never fully dimmed. There was a mechanical hum, constant, low, just audible enough to prevent true silence. And Bob was still awake. He could feel it. Even with his eyes shut, even facing the wall, he could sense the attention in the room the way you sense a draft, not seeing it, just knowing something is moving. At some point in the small hours, the mattress shifted. Bob's voice came from somewhere too close, quiet, almost gentle. He said, "You're too young to be in a place like this. Someone ought to be looking out for you." The kid did not respond. He barely breathed. He lay completely still and he counted seconds, not because it helped, but because it gave his mind something to hold on to besides the fear. He called his parents the next morning. His mom's voice broke before he finished his first sentence. His dad told him a lawyer was involved, that bail might come Monday, that he needed to stay quiet and calm and not draw attention. Monday felt like a country he wasn't sure he'd reach. The weekend passed in fractured pieces. He ate almost nothing. He slept in fragments, every sound from the corridor outside jolting him awake. Bob maintained his quiet attentiveness, sometimes saying nothing at all, which was, in its own way, worse than the questions. There is a specific species of fear that comes from being confined in a small space with someone whose intentions you cannot verify, and knowing there is nowhere to go, no exit, no distance you can create, just the four walls, and the hum, and the light that never goes fully dark. He learned that fear that weekend. He still carries it. Monday came. The court appearance was brief and procedural. Bail was set and paid, and by that afternoon he was standing in a parking lot in real daylight, breathing air that didn't smell like industrial cleaning products. He stood there for what felt like a long time, and then he turned his phone back on. Notifications loaded, messages, missed calls, the ordinary accumulation of a life interrupted. And then, a direct message on Instagram from an account he didn't recognize. Profile picture, a selfie, low light, deliberate angle. The account had no posts, no followers. It had existed for less than 48 hours. 3 words in the message. Miss you already. The profile picture was Bob. He blocked the account immediately, hand shaking, told himself it was over, a last reach from a desperate man, contained and finished by the press of a button. 3 weeks later, he was home alone when he noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, engine idling, no one getting out, just sitting there facing the house for the better part of 20 minutes. Then it pulled away. He called the police, filed a report. The officer was polite, professional, and entirely unconvinced that anything actionable had occurred. A car on a public street, a single blocked Instagram message, nothing to act on. He thanked the officer and hung up the phone and stood in his kitchen, understanding that the walls of a jail cell are not the only kind of cage a person can be trapped in. He checked every lock in his home 3 times that night. He has never fully stopped.
That story is about what happens when someone decides that a brief, involuntary encounter gives them a claim on you, when proximity gets mistaken for permission. The next story is different in its setting, but the mechanism is identical. Someone watched, someone waited, someone decided that the ordinary details of another person's life were theirs to collect, and they were extraordinarily patient about it.
Sarah had lived in her apartment for 2 years before she noticed that something was wrong. That's the part she comes back to most often when she tells this story. Not the specific incidents, but the 2 years of not noticing. 2 years of ordinary mornings and unremarkable evenings, during which something was already in motion that she had no awareness of. She lived alone, 3rd floor of a mid-rise building in a mid-sized city, the kind of building where everyone knows each other just enough to hold a door or wave in the lobby, but not enough to know much more than a first name, which suited Sarah fine. She worked long hours, she valued her privacy. She was, by her own description, the kind of person who existed mostly inside her own life. Her downstairs neighbor, a man in his early 60s named Gerald, was one of those hold-the-door, wave-in-the-lobby acquaintances. He'd lived in the building for years before she moved in. He was quiet, polite, the building manager liked him. He occasionally left baked goods near the mailboxes around the holidays, which everyone agreed was a kind gesture. Gerald was, in the social vocabulary of apartment buildings, a good neighbor.
The first thing Sarah noticed, and she truly didn't register it as notable at the time, was that Gerald seemed to know when she came and went. Not just an approximate schedule, specific knowledge. He'd comment on the fact that she'd gotten back late the previous Tuesday. He'd ask if her Thursday morning appointment had gone well. He'd mention that he'd noticed her light was on at 2 in the morning and hoped she was all right. Each comment, in isolation, sounded like neighborly concern, the kind of thing an older man living alone might say to a younger resident he'd taken a friendly interest in. Sarah accepted each one at face value, offered a brief response, and moved on. The comments accumulated over months. One evening, Sarah was telling a friend about Gerald, framing it as an amusing quirk, the overly attentive neighbor, and her friend stopped her mid-sentence and said, "How does he know all of that?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She began paying attention differently. She started logging the comments Gerald made. Nothing formal, just notes in her phone. What he referenced, what detail it contained, whether she had any memory of sharing that information with him. Within 3 weeks, her log had 22 entries. Gerald knew that she'd had a video call that went late on a specific Wednesday. He knew that she'd had a guest stay for 2 nights the previous month. Not who the guest was, just that someone had been there. He knew that she'd been sick in February. He knew that she'd ordered food delivery significantly more often in the fall than in the summer. None of this information was secret. All of it was observable, but observable only from somewhere very specific. A vantage point that could track the light patterns in her windows, monitor who came and went from her door, note the delivery bags left outside, listen to sounds that traveled through the floor. Gerald lived directly below her. She checked with other neighbors as discreetly as she could. Did they find that Gerald knew a lot about their routines? One woman on her floor paused for a long moment before answering and said, "Yes, actually. Yes, he does." She took her log to the building manager. The manager listened carefully, expressed concern, and then said something that Sarah still finds infuriating in retrospect. He said that Gerald had never caused any problems, that observation wasn't illegal, and that without a specific threat, there wasn't much he could do. She went to the police. She was told with genuine courtesy that the behavior she was describing, while unsettling, did not meet the legal threshold for harassment or stalking in her jurisdiction, that without a direct threat, without physical contact, without communication sent to her, there was nothing to act on. She asked, what does he have to do before something can be done? She started sleeping with a white noise machine to prevent sound from traveling downward. She installed blackout curtains so her light patterns were no longer visible from outside. She changed her routines, deliberately, inconveniently, so that anyone tracking them would lose the threat. Gerald noticed the change immediately. He mentioned it to her in the lobby one morning, said she seemed to be keeping different hours lately, asked if everything was all right. She smiled and told him everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time, but she had learned by that point that fine was the only words that ended conversations with Gerald quickly. She eventually moved. Not because the law forced her to. The law did nothing, but because she could not continue living in a space where she felt monitored, where every lamp she switched on felt like a message she hadn't consented to send, where the floor beneath her felt like a set of eyes. She moved to a new city. She did not leave a forwarding address with the building. She has not heard from Gerald since. She wonders sometimes if that's because she can't find her, or because he's simply being patient.
What Sarah's story illustrates, and what I find deeply unsettling about it, is how much of our lives we broadcast without realizing it. Light through a window, a delivery bag on a doorstep, the sound of a chair moving across a floor at 2 in the morning. We think of privacy as something we protect by locking doors and setting passwords. But privacy is also light, it's sound, it's pattern. And some people are very, very good at reading those patterns. The third story tonight involves someone who found a different kind of window to look through. A digital one.
Marcus thought he'd handled it cleanly. He'd met Daniel at a work conference, one of those networking events that exists in a parallel universe of name tags and awkward conversations over bad coffee. Daniel was in an adjacent industry, personable, funny, the kind of person who makes those events bearable. They'd talked for an hour, exchanged contact information, connected on a couple of platforms. Standard professional networking. Unremarkable. The trouble started about 6 weeks later, when Marcus began noticing that Daniel was engaging with his content in a way that felt disproportionate. Every post liked within minutes. Every story watched immediately, often rewatched. Comments that were just slightly too specific, too attentive to detail to be casual. Marcus told himself he was being oversensitive. He'd had friendships that were enthusiastic. Not everyone who paid close attention had bad intentions. He was probably reading into it. Then Daniel sent the first message. It was long, several paragraphs, warm in tone, but intimate in a way that felt disproportionate to the actual relationship, which had consisted of one conversation over bad coffee and a few months of social media connection. The message referenced specific things Marcus had posted, photos, captions, small details, in a way that suggested Daniel had gone back through months of his profile. Years, possibly. Marcus responded politely, kept it brief, tried to recalibrate the temperature of the connection by matching the length of his reply, short, to signal that this was not, from his side, a close friendship. Daniel's next message came 4 hours later, even longer. Marcus soft-blocked him, removed him as a follower without blocking outright, which turned the account private from Daniel's perspective, without sending a notification, a digital redirect, frictionless and invisible. Within a week, a new account started following him. No profile picture, no posts, just a username that was a random string of characters. He blocked it. Another appeared. He blocked that one too. Over the next 3 months, Marcus blocked 14 separate accounts. Each one would be active for a few days, watching stories, occasionally liking a post before he could make it in time, and then he'd catch it and remove it, and it would go quiet, and then another would appear. He couldn't prove they were all Daniel. That's the thing that made this particular experience so corrosive, the plausible deniability baked into every step. A random username, a new account, no explicit message, nothing to screenshot and show someone and say, look, this person is doing this to me. Just the pattern, the relentless, unmistakable pattern. He locked down every account, made everything private, scrubbed identifying details, his neighborhood, his workplace, his gym. He went through 2 years of posts and removed anything that gave location information. He changed his profile picture to something that didn't show his face. And for a while, it worked. The new account stopped appearing. He breathed. He told himself it was over. About 4 months later, Marcus ran into Daniel at another industry event. Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. Warm, easy, friendly, the exact persona he'd presented at the first conference. He asked how Marcus was doing. He made a comment about a project Marcus was working on, a project that Marcus had not posted about publicly, had not mentioned to mutual connections, had told exactly 3 people about. 3 people, none of whom knew Daniel. He reported it to the platforms. All of it, the account history, the pattern, a detailed timeline. The platforms reviewed his reports and removed several accounts for violating terms of service. He also went to the police. This time he had documentation, the log of blocked accounts, the timestamps, the message archives. The officer who took his report was attentive and thorough, and ultimately told him that what he had was compelling circumstantial evidence, but that without a direct threat or proof of identity behind the accounts, prosecution was unlikely. But the officer added one thing. Keep documenting, because patterns matter when cases go to court. Every entry in your log is a brick. You may not have a wall yet, but you're building one. Marcus found that framing unexpectedly steadying. He kept the log. He kept documenting. Daniel has not appeared again, in person or online, at least not in any form Marcus has been able to identify. But Marcus still checks. Every new follower on every platform, every unfamiliar face at an industry event, every comment that feels a half step too familiar. He says he doesn't think he'll ever fully stop checking. And I believe him.
3 stories in, and I want to take a breath with you here, because I think there's a thread running through all of these that's important to name before we reach the final account. It's not that the people in these stories did anything to invite what happened to them. It's not about fault or choices or being in the wrong place. It's about the fact that some people, a specific, rare, but genuinely dangerous category of people, move through the world treating other human beings as objects to be studied, mapped, owned. And they are extraordinarily patient. They do not announce themselves. They do not rush. They wait and they watch and they collect. And the hardest part? The part that I think the fourth story illustrates better than any of the others is that you can do everything right. You can be cautious, professional, careful, guarded, and it may still find you. Because sometimes the information they use against you wasn't given by you at all.
I'm going to tell you the last story in a slightly different way, because this one is mine. Years after the cellmate, years after the Instagram message and the idling car and the locked doors and the rebuilt sense of normalcy that I'd managed to construct around myself, I had changed cities, I had changed careers, I had become a corrections officer, and I am aware of every irony contained in that sentence. I chose that work because I needed to reclaim something. I needed to exist on the other side of those walls, to walk into a facility with authority rather than a case number, to understand the machinery of confinement from the inside of the institution rather than the inside of a cell. It helped, more than I expected it to. The work was hard and thankless and sometimes genuinely disturbing, and it also gave me back something I'd lost, a sense of competence in spaces that had once only held fear for me. I thought I had become someone who could read people, who could see manipulation when it came dressed in pleasantness. I thought I was prepared. His name was Edgar, mid-50s, quiet, immaculate behavior record, the kind of inmate that supervisors point to during briefings as an example of what rehabilitation looks like. He followed every rule. He was courteous to staff. He caused no incidents. He took an interest in me from the first week I worked his block. At first, the interest expressed itself normally, questions about how I was settling into the role, comments about shift schedules, the small talk of confined spaces. Nothing alarming. The kind of rapport that develops naturally when the same two people occupy the same rooms at the same times. Then, one afternoon during a routine check, Edgar said something that stopped me mid-stride. He mentioned my hometown. Not the city I currently lived in, the town I grew up in, a town I had moved away from years ago, a town I had never, at any point, mentioned to anyone in that facility. I was certain of that. I had been careful, the way I'd learned to be careful, about the information I gave people in professional settings. I kept my face neutral. I finished the check. I walked back to the station and I sat down and I thought. I chose the reasonable explanations. Coincidence, a mutual connection I wasn't aware of, something overheard and half remembered. I chose them because they were available and because the alternative required a level of dread I wasn't ready to carry back into a day shift. But it happened again. Over the following weeks, Edgar demonstrated a pattern of knowing things he had no access to. My sister's name, not guessed, mentioned. The approximate neighborhood where I currently lived, not my street, not my building, but close enough to be wrong only by degrees. The make and color of my car. Each piece of information delivered in passing, conversationally, plausibly deniable. The kind of thing that would sound like paranoia if I tried to explain it to someone who hadn't been in that room. I brought it to my supervisor. She listened. She was professionally careful with her response. Acknowledged it was unusual, suggested Edgar might be assembling fragments from multiple sources, reminded me that inmates sometimes fixate on newer staff as a form of psychological leverage. She told me to document everything. She was right about the documentation. I'm less sure she was right about the rest. Edgar was released on a Thursday morning. Standard end of sentence. I wasn't working that day. When I came in for the next shift, he was already gone, and I remember feeling something I can only describe as relief wearing a question mark. 11 days later, my doorbell rang at 11:47 at night. I pulled up the feed from my bedroom. Dark porch, wrong angle of light, but there was a figure, standing still, facing the door. Not ringing again, not moving, just standing.
I called the police from inside my bedroom. The figure was gone before the patrol car arrived. The officers checked the perimeter, took my report, reviewed the footage. They asked if I had any idea who it might be. I told them about Edgar. I gave them every detail I had. They ran his information. His last known address, the shelter listed on his release paperwork, confirmed that he had checked in once and left without providing any forwarding information. No current address, no traceable phone, no social media presence under any name associated with him. Edgar, as far as the system was concerned, had simply dissolved into the world.
I want to describe what it feels like to know that someone has demonstrated, methodically, over time, that they know the details of your life, and then to find that same person completely unfindable. It is a very specific kind of terror, not the terror of a threat you can name and address, the terror of a gap, an absence where a danger should be visible but isn't. You cannot prepare for what you cannot locate. You cannot protect against what you cannot define. You are left with two options. Assume the worst and live in a state of permanent, exhausting vigilance. Or choose to believe it was coincidence and live in a state of willed, fragile denial. Neither of those is actually living. The doorbell didn't ring again. Not that week. Not that month. Time passed. It always passes. And the acute terror settled into something lower and more chronic. A background frequency. Always present. Just quieter. I still think about Edgar. I still think about how he knew my sister's name. About how patient someone has to be to collect that kind of information without ever appearing to try. About what the intention was.
4 stories, 4 people, 4 very different situations, connected by a single, unsettling truth. The people who frightened them were not strangers in the dark. They were the cellmate, the neighbor, the professional contact, the inmate who used your own institutional records against you. They were people who already had access. If tonight's stories gave you something to think about, and I hope they did, I hope they gave you the useful kind of discomfort, that I want to leave you with a few things that I genuinely believe could matter. Document everything. If something feels wrong, an interaction, a comment, a car parked one too many times on the same street, write it down, date it, keep it somewhere safe. A single report often disappears. A pattern of reports becomes evidence, and evidence changes what law enforcement can do. Trust the feeling before you have the proof. Every person in tonight's stories had a moment, early, before anything escalated, when something felt off. They all found reasons to dismiss it. I'm not saying alarm is always warranted. I'm saying the feeling deserves attention rather than dismissal. Information is currency. Everything you share about your schedule, your location, your family, your routines, it is all observable and collectible. Be intentional about who receives it. Not paranoid, intentional. And finally, persist with authorities. I know the stories tonight showed institutional response that was frustrating and sometimes inadequate. I know that firsthand, but persistence matters. The more documented, the more reported, the more visible a pattern becomes. Don't give up on that process, even when the process disappoints you. To everyone who listened tonight, thank you. These stories are not easy to sit with. They are not supposed to be. The world is not always the safe, comprehensible place we want it to be, but understanding how certain dangers work, recognizing the patience, the information gathering, the slow accumulation, is a genuine form of protection. I'll see you in the dark.